my guess here is that what would happen is that one day you would just have this breaking point in the Kremlin where there would be people on the inside of the Kremlin who would say, you've got to go. Vladimir, you've got to step down. Whether or not we force you out or whether you, quote, retire gracefully, you've got to go. But then I think you immediately have a contest for power amongst those people to try to be the next leaders. And they could be civilian, they could be military. I'm sorry, I can't give you a definitive answer here, is because there's not one model for how regimes fall apart. There are different ways they are broken, and there are different ways, there are different things that come in the aftermath, and not all of them, we have to be honest here, not all of them are productive. If Putin goes, you could face even further destruction and damage as Russia falls into chaos.
Joining us today, Scott Lukas, Professor of International Politics at the University College Dublin's Clinton Institute. Welcome to our program.
Oh, thank you so much for having me here. It's always the highlight of my week.
Thank you. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelenskyy warns that Russia could lose up to $50 billion next year due to recent U.S. sanctions. Also, according to Ukrainian presidential office, Russia could also lose up to $100 billion next year if these sanctions are properly enforced. Meanwhile, China, India, and Turkey have halted its crude oil supplies from Russia. Can Vladimir Putin really survive this, both politically and militarily?
Well, we have to wait and see, because the American sanctions, specifically on the two major Russian oil producers, Rosneft and Lukoil, only came into effect a few days ago, November the 1st. The significance, as you already have pointed out, is not the direct effect on those companies. They hold, I think, only about $5 billion in assets in the United States. The significance is on the buyers of oil from those companies, because they could face secondary sanctions. They could be punished if they keep taking the Russian oil. So what do we know so far about those major purchasers? Well, the three leading purchasers are Turkey, China, and India. The Turks have begun to reduce their purchases of Russian oil and are looking for alternative suppliers. And I suspect behind the scenes, the Americans will be helping with that because one potential source for energy supplies will, of course, be the United States itself. The Indians, who are the second largest purchasers of Russian oil, have begun to edge away from purchases of Russian oil as well. We don't know quite how much, but they have reduced the volumes by a certain extent. The Chinese, who are the largest purchasers, in the first few days of November, their purchases are down by about 40%. Now, that's only, however, data over the past week. Do the Chinese and the Indians and the Turks continue to reduce their purchases of Russian oil, not just for 1 week, but for a month, for 2 months, for 3 months, for 6 months? That's when it becomes significant. And that's when those numbers that you've just quoted, whether it be from President Zelenskyy, whether it be from other Ukrainian officials, when they might come into the frame. Russia could lose $50 billion or could lose $100 billion. But that's going to take time. So I think it's just simply a caution here, which is, I think the Americans finally taking this step was significant. I think it is significant in that it puts down a marker regarding where the Russian oil sales go further. It's in conjunction with what I hope will be the European Union cutting off all imports of Russian energy. But it will take months before I think we really see the effects in terms of hitting the Russian economy, but also constraining the amount of money and resource that Russia can devote to the invasion and the aerial attacks on Ukraine.
Also, Russian dictator Vladimir Putin recently has signed a law authorizing permanent mobilization inside Russia. Usually this mobilization take place like once per year, but he has authorized directed permanent state of mobilization there. How does that sound as Putin boasts about his so-called success in Pokrovsk?
Well, generally, the Kremlin is walking the tightrope between the amount of men, personnel, as well as resources they have to put into this invasion, which is now in its 46th month of the full-scale attack. They walk the tightrope between how much they have to devote to that and the fiction that it's just a special military operation. Really not that, not that critical. And of course, you might get away with that if it's 1 month, 2 months, 3 months, which they hope they would do. They hope Ukraine would surrender in the spring of 2022. But when you have to do it after almost 4 years, the fiction is exposed because Russia does have the conscription at certain points during the year. But now to say effectively we're on a permanent conscription approach, that's a big change. I think the real change that I'm watching for is that officially Russia does not send conscripts to the front line. Officially, they handle duties well behind the front line. They may have been involved in the attempt to regain territory in Western Russia, in Kursk, between August of 24 until earlier this year. But you don't see them on the front line in Ukraine. Does Russia change that? Does Russia start sending conscripts and other mobilized men to that front line? Because that simply will just take apart the fiction that this is a special military operation. It's a war. It's a war. And, how many personnel, how many men will the Russians have to continue to pour into it if they want to hope to advance, including in an area like Pokrovsk, which we can talk about, in detail if you wish.
And I would like to maybe switch to another topic. I would like to discuss what happened in Moscow yesterday, because we know that yesterday Russian dictator Putin has called an emergency meeting of Russia's Security Council right after the U.S. military conducted a test launch of its new Minuteman III intercontinental ballistic missile without a nuclear warhead. And reportedly, Putin even ordered preparations for potential nuclear tests. Do you think Moscow is in panic mode right now?
I think it's a case of the Kremlin and the Trump administration both trying to be the biggest bully in the room because of what the real cause of this was. And let's walk this back to last month when we were wondering if the Trump administration would give Tomahawk cruise missiles to Ukraine for the attacks inside Russia. Now, Putin did not want that, clearly did not want that. And he talked Trump out of making that commitment to Vladimir Zelenskyy when he was in the White House. We know that. But there's still the possibility that the Americans will supply those Tomahawks. They're not off the table, as Zelenskyy said. So Putin wants to continue to push that back. So what does he do? He says, I have a new nuclear-powered missile, the Burevestnik. It can fly long distances, and look at me. Look at this nuclear-powered missile. And he says, and we have a nuclear-powered naval drone, a super torpedo called the Poseidon. Look how tough we are with that. And then Donald Trump, who doesn't really understand the details of this, comes out and puts out this misleading message on social media, which says, Russia is conducting nuclear testing and China is conducting nuclear testing. We have to nuclear test as well. Now, that's actually false. Russia has not tested nuclear warheads. China has not tested nuclear warheads. The only country to test nuclear warheads since the 1990s is North Korea. And they stopped that in 2017. But because Trump put out this tweet, which was, we will resume our nuclear testing, whether that's of missiles that are nuclear capable or whether that's of nuclear warheads, then the Kremlin feels like, we have to respond. So what does the Kremlin do? They say, oh, we have the Orezhnik, which of course they talked about several months ago, and we can use that. You don't want us to use that. And then, as you mentioned, you have this meeting of the National Security Council, State Security Council in Moscow, and the Defense Secretary Belousov comes out and says, we have authorized, we are preparing for the resumption of nuclear testing. It's all a bit vague because here's the reality, and reality is important. Even if the Trump administration wanted to renew testing of nuclear warheads, it would take 36 months, 3 years to set up those tests. Donald Trump would probably be out of office by then, right? So I think it is a battle of rhetoric. And the significance really here is how deep is this division between the Trump administration and the Kremlin now? Because let's get beyond the nuclear issue. Let's push that to the side. The deeper the division between the Trump administration and the Kremlin, the more likely it is that the responsible people in Washington can encourage Trump to give more support to Ukraine against that big bad bully, Vladimir, who just simply won't listen to Donald's reasonable tweets.
And since you already mentioned Andrei Belousov, yesterday one of his arguments was that Washington not only held drills but also plans to deploy missiles in Germany that could reach central Russia in just 6 or 7 minutes. Do you think now Russia is really ready for a new nuclear arms race, given that Western sanctions are slowly but steadily eroding its economy?
Well, first of all, let's deal with reality versus the Kremlin, because that's news to me about these supposed U.S. missiles that are in Germany that, to reach Russia in 6 to 7 minutes. I mean, unless it's super top secret, and none of us have found out about this. Belousov made that up. All right. What is more serious here to consider is that NATO is reviewing its defensive plans in light of the fact that, as Mark Rutte, the current NATO head, and as the former NATO head, Anders Fogh Rasmussen, just said, this is a long-term conflict with Russia. And so it's not just, American missiles you've got to talk about. You have to talk about NATO's defenses, European missiles as well. That includes air defense missiles. It includes other surface-to-air missiles that take place. So that's actually the reasonable, what we can debate here is in what kind, is Russia prepared to not only carry out this open-ended invasion of Ukraine, but are they prepared to really expand the conflict with NATO? If not a direct military conflict, at least the threat of that conflict. And I think that takes us back to our earlier topics, and that is, this is not just a question of if Russia has missiles it can put out there. It's not just a question of if they have the drones, that could be in this new form of warfare. It's a question of whether the Russian economy can take on an expanded conflict with Europe. And right now, you have Russia saying, yeah, we can do this. We're preparing for it. But you also have the European Union and European countries who are making serious financial, economic, and military decisions. Now, who am I going to bet on the longer run? Am I going to bet on a Kremlin who already is facing economic difficulties, who does not have secure long-term partners, because China and India are not secure long-term partners for the Russians? Or am I going to bet on a European Union of 27 countries and a NATO of 32 countries, which, although it has its issues, we know that you have that larger group of countries that can provide some type of economic and military resilience? Well, I'm going to bet on the Europeans.
Let's also cover situation in Pokrovsk. Ukrainian military intelligence have conducted special operations are personally observed by General Budanov, and Russian dictator Vladimir Putin is trying to demonstrate his so-called propaganda victories there. If Russia captures the city of Pokrovsk, could this help Vladimir Putin to survive and to justify the enormous cost of this war paid by his own population?
First of all, let's talk about what we know about the situation in Pokrovsk, or at least what I know, and you can help me out here. And that is, you have a very fluid situation inside this city, which had a pre-war population of about 60,000 people. The Russians have gotten units into the city. This started a few weeks ago. They infiltrated initially with small groups. Now they're trying to establish their position over parts of the city. But Ukraine has responded, as you mentioned, by putting in special forces, by deploying other units. And the situation shifts on an hour-by-hour basis. Now, let us assume, for the sake of your question, that the Russians can take control of Pokrovsk, which is a devastated city. I mean, there's no immediate value in terms of Pokrovsk, which was a logistics hub, providing anything of value because it has been leveled. But still, Russia has finally gained a city in the Donetsk region. This, I think, would be their fifth city or large town since May of 2023, when Bakhmut fell. I think there's Bakhmut, there's Vuhledar, there's Avdiivka. I think I'm leaving one out. But they've been trying to take Pokrovsk since July of 2024. So part of the story here is if they do overrun Pokrovsk, it took them 16 months to do this at a very high rate of casualties. It will be portrayed by the Kremlin as a big victory. They will try to use this as a PR win, the same way they used Bakhmut. I can remember this back in May of 23. It may buy them a bit of time with their own population, but it's not a turning point in the war on the ground. Ukraine has larger towns which are logistics hubs. They will rebuild the defensive lines along those towns, and it'll be even tougher for the Russians to take those than it would be Pokrovsk, unless there's an unexpected collapse of Ukrainian forces, which I don't foresee at this point. So the ground war is a marathon. It's not a sprint. Russia's trying to gamble that it gets a little bit of a boost to run the next mile. And it might do so. It might do so. And certainly for the Ukrainian population, it will hurt to lose Pokrovsk. But I think the Ukrainian population knows that, it took the Russians 16 months to do this at very high cost. And I think the Ukrainian population, more importantly, knows that doesn't mean we give up the rest of Donetsk. And that's what we're really talking about here. What the Russians are hoping with Pokrovsk is they're hoping it can make Ukraine give up on holding the rest of Donetsk, and that Ukraine will come into negotiations and give up the rest of Donetsk. And I don't think we're there yet. The other angle on this is that the Russians could possibly try to use this to tell Donald Trump, oh, look, we're winning, Donald, we're winning. You like to side with the winners. If Donald Trump knew a lot about the Ukrainian situation, that might work. But I'm not sure he even knows where Pokrovsk is. So I think the fall of Pokrovsk, if it happens, is just a minor. It's just a minor alteration on a war which is being conducted on multiple fronts.
And how could this, if this happens, how could this influence U.S. administration mind? You just mentioned about President Trump, that he even doesn't know where Pokrovsk is located. However, how could this play out in this bigger game between U.S., Russia, Ukraine, as this geopolitical fight?
I think someone like Trump's envoy to Russia, who's one of the big pro-Kremlin voices in the administration, Steve Witkoff, the real estate developer, he could go to Trump and say, the Russians are going to eventually win. Look, they took Pokrovsk. You need to get Ukraine to accept that. And then we're back to where we were, remember, in the meeting between Trump and Zelenskyy last month, when Witkoff said, why don't you just give up all of the Donbass, Donetsk and Luhansk regions, because there are Russian speakers there? But again, at the end of the meeting, Trump came out and said, well, no, I want a ceasefire based on the current front lines. And I think that's the question here is could someone like Witkoff, possibly someone like J.D. Vance, the vice president, could they convince Trump to tell Kyiv, no, you need to negotiate on the basis of giving up all of Donetsk? Or does Trump continue to hold the line of, no, we just freeze the front line as it is? In this case, Pokrovsk would be, scorched earth, but would technically be part of Russian occupied territory going into those negotiations. I think that's really the only shift that's made at this point. Trump's been a bit distracted the past week or so from Ukraine. There have been a series of issues, but the big one is that he took a heavy defeat in elections this week in the U.S. So I'm not sure he's really focused on Ukraine. If he refocuses on Ukraine, or at least pretends to in the next few days, we'll get a clue. But until then, I think we're still in the same position we are regarding with the Trump administration, with some support from Ukraine, from the adults in the room, but still that unpredictable guy in the White House that you have to keep an eye on.
However, U.S. President Donald Trump says that sometimes you have to let them fight until both sides are ready to reach a ceasefire deal. How do you read this statement? What does this mean about Trump's intent, position, and does he feel that he can give Russia another 6 months and then force Putin to settle this war?
No, that's Trump's temper tantrum. Every time he doesn't get the peace deal and the Nobel Peace Prize, and again, largely because Vladimir Putin does not want to go into negotiations. He's like, oh, that's it. I'm going to walk away. I'm going to take my ball and go home, as we used to say in America, and just let him fight it out. We've had that for 9 months. Marco Rubio, the Secretary of State, said this back in the spring. The reality here is, and let's compare this, in February, there was a serious chance that the Trump administration would walk away completely from Ukraine. Now we're in a position in November where, because of the more responsible people in Washington, there are U.S. military supplies that go to Ukraine via sale to NATO countries. We are in a position where those supplies will include air defenses, where they will include some equipment used on the front line, and where it will include possibly some supplies, rocket systems, for example, to help Ukraine counterattack against the Russians. We are in a position where, as we talked about earlier, the Trump administration has sanctions on Russia now, which could have a significant effect. We're in a position where the Trump administration is providing intelligence to Ukraine, including for attacks inside Russia. We are in a position where, through the rare earth mineral deal, you have a commitment by the Trump administration to a reconstruction and recovery fund in Ukraine. All those things we did not think were not there in February. They are there now. So it's harder for America to walk away from what it's committed to, especially because of this. If you had asked me this several years ago, when Donald Trump was threatening to withdraw from NATO, yeah, that's a really serious situation. Trump is no longer threatening to leave NATO. And we could talk about why in another podcast, but the U.S. is now involved in NATO. The U.S. is now involved in terms of that encouragement of NATO members to increase their spending, their GDP, percentage of GDP on defense. They're involved in planning for NATO's reorganization of defense against Russia. If you walk away from Ukraine now, you're walking away from NATO as well. And I think there are enough people in the United States, not just in his administration, but in Congress and enough Americans who realize you cannot walk away from NATO and European defense. You can't just simply pretend it's all about China, because what Putin has done is he's posed the most serious threat to not just to Ukraine, but to Europe since 1945.
Another interesting information from Ukrainian intelligence, and I think it's also a bit a disturbing fact, that Russia is now training 8th and 9th grade school students to operate drones, especially raising, we can call it a generation built for war. Do you think they are doing this to continue this never-ending war against Ukraine, or they will prepare this young man for a possible war against NATO countries?
It's part of a militarized society. I'm old enough that I actually grew up. My boyhood was spent in the Cold War. My teenage years and even into my 20s, there was that idea of America, not just the Soviet Union, but America. where the military was this key part, and you might have to fight the communist. And the Soviet Union did the same thing. Won't make this a history lesson, but you all will know very well in Ukraine about the whole history of the organizations, like the Young Pioneers, for example, that children would have these camps and these organizations. And part of that patriotism for the Soviet Union was the idea that you had a great Soviet military that you were part of. So in some ways, this isn't entirely new for Soviet or for Russian culture to do this. But of course, it's happening in Russia at a time when you have this open-ended, full-scale invasion, and where the Kremlin will worry, the longer this goes on, is will our young people keep supporting us, or will they want something better, something different? Because, young people may not necessarily want to have to go to war. They may not necessarily want to have to operate drones, even as exciting and as much as it seems like a video game. They may want to simply have a life where they can get a job, have homes, eventually get married, and not have to think about war on a day-in, day-in basis. So what do? When children are young, you teach them the military is a good thing. War, or at least the special military operation, may be a necessary thing. And you make it hands-on. So you don't just tell them about the drones, you get them to carry out the drone warfare, and then you publicize it. And you all will have seen all the photographs. There'll be loads of photographs, all the children. Again, I'll come back to this, and that is, I'll use a Cold War parallel. I saw this, and it was part of Soviet society from 1945 until 1991. You all will know people in Ukraine who are old enough to have been part of that, right? There came one day in the Soviet Union when, for all that military, whether you call it training, indoctrination, propaganda, people got tired of that. And why did they get tired of it in the Soviet Union? Because they wanted food. They wanted enough food on the table. They wanted decent housing. They wanted decent health care. They didn't just want to be fighting in other places. It so happened that Afghanistan was the breaking point probably for the Soviet Union at this point. Will Ukraine be the breaking point for Russia with this type of military economy? Like we talked about it earlier, I don't think it will happen in the near future. But yeah, down the line, at the end of the day, military indoctrination runs into problems and difficulties when the economy runs into problems and difficulties. Because people's day-to-day security starts not with a big bad army. It starts with being able to eat and have a roof over their heads.
Do you think now Russians see that this propaganda?
They know it's propaganda. Yeah, the thing about propaganda is that
they will understand. That once they understand.
I think so. Look, I think people know it's propaganda, right? I mean, for me, and I teach propaganda, so at least this is my idea on it, is that propaganda isn't lying to people. That's not the way that they see it, that they're lying to it. On the other hand, it's not like complete truth-telling. We know that. Propaganda is like someone who wants to keep power, stay in power, trying to make you think, oh yeah, I'll support that. So people buy into the propaganda, right? They buy into it, so in this case, they buy into the idea of this strong Russian military and this idea of defending Mother Russia and supporting Mother Russia. And they know that it's a story. It's almost at times like a fairy tale. But if you don't believe the story in the fairy tale, then you're on the outside, right? You're on the outside. You're not part of Russia anymore. You're not part of that propaganda. And again, I'll come back to you. Talk to folks in Ukraine who had to endure that and were part of that, right? That there would be some people in Ukraine during the Soviet era who would have bought into that propaganda, but then when the Soviet Union collapsed, it's like, we don't have to buy into it anymore. We don't have to do this. And I think the bigger question here is, beyond the Russian military, is how many Russians still buy into the propaganda about that single leader who has to be the person that they just can't let go of him, right? They will know that the Kremlin has problems. They will know that the economy has problems. But at some point, and I think it's coming up soon, Vladimir Putin will come out and he'll have a State of the Union 3 or 4 hours answering their questions. And he will put out all that propaganda, and this will be a show which is, this is your leader. Don't abandon your leader. And for now, I mean, I know that we all hope that it wouldn't be the case, that Russians would find a better future and get rid of Putin. But for now, I think most Russians, whether or not they like it, that's still the guy that they're tied to.
From your perspective, how could look Russia after Vladimir Putin's rule? And second question would be, would Russia be able to be less militaristic after Putin's rule and after his presidential office, after he leaves the office?
We don't know. We don't know, because very few changes like that are orderly that takes place. I mean, I could probably think of a country like South Africa, which was relatively orderly after the system of apartheid. But if you look at, let me use the parallel of between 89 and 91, in that entire run of countries in Central and Eastern Europe, when the Soviet Union was collapsing, you have this variety of experiences in terms of what happens in terms of this change of power. And, you could talk about it in terms of East Germany, in terms of what was then Czechoslovakia, in terms of Hungary. What made it distinctive in the Soviet Union, if you remember back in 1991, is that you had someone who, at the end was not a militaristic leader. You had Gorbachev. You had someone who was actually working with the international community and with the West. But all of a sudden, the Soviet Union's collapsing. And then there was that period of time in the summer of 91 when we're like, yeah, is it going to be the military and the intelligence services that are going to take over? And there was a real prospect of that. And then Yeltsin emerges from that, right? But even that period in the 90s in post-Soviet Union Russia, it's not a path to democracy. It's not like this easy way forward. It's fraught with all types of economic and political difficulties. And while there's never a vacuum of power in post-Soviet Russia, there are a lot of maneuvers for power, which means it is not a system, which I would say, which is a distinctive break from the Soviet past. Certainly not in the case of Putin. Now, if Putin was to fall from power, it's part of a question of it's how he falls from power. I mean, and this is, with respect, I don't think this is going to happen. I don't think Ukraine's going to militarily defeat Russia by going in and, going into Moscow. So you're not talking about that type of fall from power. I think instead what you have is that you have either an embarrassing retreat where Putin has to give up on the idea of conquering Ukraine, and so he's seen to fail, or you have what we've been talking about here, which is that economic erosion of Russia that takes place. Okay, well, who gets rid of him? Is it the military that rises up against him? And we had a coup attempt, the Prigozhin Wagner Group attempt back in 2023, which had support of some military figures in Moscow. That failed. Would it be that type of thing? Would it be the intelligence services that would rise up against one of their own? I mean, Putin came out of the KGB. Would it be some type of mass people's movement that replaced him? If so, who would be the opposition politicians that would be, sort of the figures of that movement that could take over? All those variables you have to work through. I would say to you that, and I'm not a Russian specialist, a detailed Russian specialist. There are other people like Mark Galeotti who I rely on, or Keir Giles, but I would say that my guess here is that what would happen is that one day you would just have this breaking point in the Kremlin where there would be people on the inside of the Kremlin who would say, you've got to go. Vladimir, you've got to step down. Whether or not we force you out or whether you, quote, retire gracefully, you've got to go. But then I think you immediately have a contest for power amongst those people to try to be the next leaders. And they could be civilian, they could be military. I'm sorry, I can't give you a definitive answer here, is because there's not one model for how regimes fall apart. There are different ways they are broken, and there are different ways, there are different things that come in the aftermath, and not all of them, we have to be honest here, not all of them are productive. You know, if Putin goes, you could face even further destruction and damage as Russia falls into chaos.
But do you believe that there could be some people who would be brave enough to tell Vladimir Putin, right, it's high time for you to go, Mr. President, or face some serious consequences?
Well, there's certainly some people who've been telling him that the war isn't going well. And you saw what happened to Dmitry Kozak a few weeks ago. Senior official in the Kremlin, had been there for a long time, and finally Putin forced him out. And you know, your viewers out there, I'd refer them to what I think is a very good article in the Guardian of London today by Piotr Sauer, which talks about a number of people who have been purged from inside the Kremlin in recent weeks. So I think Putin fears that it could happen. Now, of course, by purging those people, has he removed the threat that they will stand up to him and criticize him? At the end of the day, what will make the difference, we could bring all this together, is just how the next 6 months goes, right? You know, does Russia get a breakthrough in Ukraine? If Russia gets a breakthrough in Ukraine, if all of a sudden Ukraine has to sue for peace and give up more territory, Putin's fine. If he does not make a breakthrough, he doesn't knock Ukraine out by breaking up the energy facilities, if he doesn't break through on the front line, then he's still got that economic pressure. And that, again, would be a question of a combination of officials. For example, the head of the central bank, who's a very impressive bureaucrat, very, very impressive in terms of how she's managed the economy so far. But she told Putin back in 2022 that she could not keep this going indefinitely, and she's still trying to hold on. So would she dare to talk to ministers like the economy minister to say, you've got to tell Putin there's no way forward? Would Belousov, the defense minister, who's an economist, would he dare to say this, right? Certainly Dmitry Medvedev's never going to say that, for reasons we know very well about Dmitry Medvedev, partly because he's not actually, let's say, completely reliable in terms of his thought patterns. So, you know, it's the one thing I can tell you, and I think we have to be honest here, what Putin has done quite successfully by waging this war is he's decapitated the opposition movement in Russia. You know, we can tell the story of Alexei Navalny. We can debate whether or not Navalny would have been that opposition leader, but Navalny's gone, right? And you've had other leaders that are gone. And while there is an opposition movement inside Russia, there are very brave people who want a different Russia. They do not have the organization right now. They have been suppressed and repressed. So it would have to be a move from inside the Kremlin. And at this point, I don't see that happening. Come back to, let's talk next spring. And if they haven't broken through next spring, and if the Russian economy is flatlining, then that'll be a moment when I think we can revise our projections.
Thank you, Professor Lukas, for your time and for your support for Ukraine, and glory to Ukraine.
Slava Ukraina. Thank you both very much.